More than a few times, both in person and in the comments on my channel, I or my family have been accused of being something like a scourge on the environment because my wife and I are raising a large family. We have currently 7 kids and 1 on the way. But I would actually argue that if good stewardship of the environment is important to you, then you should consider big families not only completely compatible with that goal, but actually a benefit to it. Now, I understand that for those of you who have been led to adopt certain assumptions, that seems counterintuitive. I get that. So let me try to explain why. I'll start by pointing out that the moral quality of being environmentally conscious is an undeniably luxurious position to hold. And the reason we know that is because it's only found in communities and societies and nations even that are economically and politically prosperous. And not just a little prosperous, I mean prosperous on a scale that defies the standards of everyone who has ever lived prior to us. I'm talking about people for whom the threat of hunger, drought, storms, the elements, and war are relatively unfamiliar to their experience outside of like movies and video games. And I know it can be hard to understand that not having direct experience of those things is exceptional, but it's usually people who take their privilege for granted that have the largest blind spot to that privilege. So it's worth pointing out how rare a life lived on planet Earth, spared from those things, actually is. Because here's the thing, if you live under desperate economic conditions, the kinds where you don't know if you'll find food tomorrow or the next day for you and your family, you wouldn't give the slightest concern for the environment. It would be the last thing on your mind. If you live in an unstable political situation, your main priorities are something like, I hope I don't get killed or imprisoned today. I hope my children don't get abducted and initiated into some sort of child army. Or I hope a mine doesn't explode under my feet while I'm walking down to the river to get some water. If that was your day-to-day life and someone said, hey, you should be more careful about your carbon footprint, you'd have to be very, very polite and patient to resist telling them to get bent. So the point being here that if you want people to adjust their behavior so that the environment is protected and preserved, you have to get them to care about the environment. And in order to get them to care, you have to alleviate their more immediate adversities. In short, and unfortunately to repeat myself, you have to establish political and economic prosperity in order to get people to then turn their attention to something like environmental stewardship. Now, any economist worth his or her degree will tell you that population decline leads to economic decline, and population collapse leads to economic collapse. Population growth is an essential contributor to economic growth and prosperity. So reducing people's economic potential by sterilizing them through short-sighted sexual reproduction prescriptions is not going to be a great way to promote the protection of the environment. And this is a big problem in countries like Canada, where I live, the UK, Germany, Italy, and the United States, because we aren't reproducing and growing our populations domestically. And in order to prop up our populations, we have to compensate for our lack of reproduction with aggressive immigration policies, which is massively ironic because through the wisdom of the sexual revolution, which now inspires the way that we even teach our kids and the things that we teach them in school, we've embraced an ethos of sterilization. We look down on big families like mine, and believe me, that contempt isn't subtle in our experience. Yet, we benefit from cultures and nations that are reproducing through immigration. Without countries like those on the African continent with much superior birth rates and the willingness of their population to immigrate, our economic prospects, they'd collapse. We depend on them and their higher birth rates to sustain our way of life, which we depend on to sustain our attention and concern for the environment. The fact is, our contraceptive-obsessed society needs big families, either domestic or foreign, to prevent economic collapse, which is why we endorse the reproductivity of foreigners by inviting their vitality into our communities. To resent domestic families with lots of children while importing foreign families with lots of children, I mean, it's just peak hypocrisy. And for those who are intellectually haunted by the specter of overpopulation, you should know that those fears originated with 19th century economic theories from personalities like Thomas Robert Malthus, who, by the way, has proven to be about as reliable a forecaster, economic or otherwise, as every failed doomsday cult leader from that same time period. He's the same guy who inspired Dickens's writing of Ebenezer Scrooge, who decried the poor as surplus population, and Aldous Huxley's dystopian Brave New World, where women are forced to wear Malthusian belts by the one world government in order to regulate their fertility. In short, Malthus was wrong, brutally wrong. His predictions didn't come true, and his wrong-headedness produced a legacy of hysteria for fears that never materialized. But the residue of that panic still influences a lot of environmentalist thinking today. Scientific journalist Robert Kunzig apparently calculated that the entire population of the planet could fit in the state of Texas and be allotted the same living standards that are typical in New York City right now, which, even if you quibble with his calculations, is a startling illustration of how big our planet is in contrast to our population. And yeah, it might be that the city you live in is poorly run and feels overcrowded, but don't let that fool you into adopting long since debunked economic theories from the Victorian era, and then use that as a pretext to tell women that they should sterilize themselves. Now, the other reason that I think bigger families are a benefit to the environment is the same reason that a lot of environmentalists will promote public transport. It's a more efficient use of our resources. So what do I mean by that? If I had to guess, I'd say that the average home in the neighborhood that I live in has about probably 3 people living in it. And that's relevant because that means they're living in a similar lifestyle to me in terms of resources. Their homes are the same size and require the same amount of heating. They all have 2-car garages and probably use the cars a lot more than I do and my family. And when they do, they're likely only transporting like 1 or 2 people on average, whereas we're transporting a whole group of people. In short, they dedicate a similar amount of energy resources to their lifestyle, but only in the service of like 2 or 3 people, whereas my family is using those same resource portions in the service of 10 people. The way that my family lives out of necessity is a way more efficient use of energy resources than most other families, and we make sacrifices to do so. We learn to live with less. We learn to live with less space, less cars, less vacations. We live within certain limits that our circumstances impose on us. More people means less space and a lot of sharing of resources, which then becomes a habitual way of life. When my kids become independent, they aren't going to be used to having their own bedrooms and their own space and their own TVs, their own cars, and their own suite of electricity consuming devices. They will be conditioned by a more simple way of life that is characterized by the limits of being in a big family. They've learned to live with and be happy with less. And if nothing else, that is the key to environmental consciousness. It's learning to live with less. Can I ask you to stick around for 1 extra minute? Because if you enjoyed that, well, first of all, thanks for watching. But now I could really benefit from your help, which you can do in a couple of ways. You can check out my sponsor, Real Estate for Life, who is a network of pro-family real estate agents that can connect you with one in your area. So if you're looking to buy a home, check them out at realestateforlife.org. And if you can help out directly financially, I tend to trust that most of my regular viewers can afford to drop a $5 tip in my jar once a year. And if they did, I wouldn't have to worry about the financial viability of this effort. So if you do want to support, you can go to brianholdsworth.ca/support or join me in my locals community to get exclusive content and chances to interact with me and members of the like-minded community at brianholdsworth.locals.com.